The silence inside the house had a weight to it, heavy and unmoving, as if it had settled there long ago and decided never to leave. Elena sat by the narrow window, her shoulders wrapped in a faded shawl, watching the slow drift of dust in the afternoon light, each tiny particle floating like a memory that refused to settle. The street outside was alive with distant voices and passing footsteps, yet none of them ever paused at their gate anymore. Victor lay on the worn sofa behind her, his boots still on, hands folded across his chest, staring at the ceiling where thin cracks branched like veins. They had once laughed beneath that ceiling, once argued, once planned futures that included children's voices echoing through the rooms. Now the house remembered those sounds even if the people did not. Their children had left one by one, first for studies, then for work, then for lives that no longer had space for two aging parents in a quiet, forgotten house. At first, there were phone calls filled with hurried affection and promises of visits. Then excuses replaced promises. Then silence replaced excuses. Elena still kept the phone charged, still glanced at it each morning as if it might suddenly remember them. Victor had stopped checking long ago. He had learned that hope, when stretched too thin, became another kind of pain. That afternoon, Elena stepped into the garden with a shovel, not because the soil needed turning, but because her hands needed something to do. The garden had once been her pride, filled with neat rows and careful care, but neglect had crept in slowly, just like loneliness. As she pressed the shovel into the earth, it struck something hard with a dull, metallic thud that sent a sharp vibration up her arms. She froze, listening, then struck again. The sound was unmistakable, stone or metal, buried where soil should be soft. Victor heard the noise from inside and forced himself up with a quiet groan, irritation flickering across his face until he saw Elena kneeling in the dirt, brushing soil away with trembling fingers. Together they uncovered the edge of a flat stone slab, its surface cracked and darkened with age, iron hinges barely visible beneath rust and roots. Neither of them remembered it being there. They had lived in this house for decades, raised children, buried pets, planted trees, and yet the ground beneath their feet had kept this secret. Victor pulled at the weeds growing over the slab, his heart pounding with a feeling he could not name, part fear, part curiosity, part something dangerously close to hope. When they finally cleared enough earth to lift it, the stone shifted with a groan, releasing a breath of cold, damp air that smelled of old stone and forgotten time. Elena stepped back instinctively, her hand flying to her chest, while Victor stood frozen, staring into the darkness below. The opening revealed narrow stone steps descending into blackness, edges worn smooth as if many feet had passed there long ago. Neither spoke for a long moment. The unspoken truth hung between them. Their children were gone. Their days were quiet. And yet here was something hidden, something untouched, waiting beneath their own home. Elena felt a strange tightening in her throat, not fear, but a sense of being called, as if the earth itself had been patiently waiting for them to notice. Victor closed the slab gently, as though afraid the darkness might escape, then looked at Elena with eyes that held more emotion than he had shown in years. For the first time since their children had stopped calling, something had broken the routine of waiting and disappointment. That night, neither of them slept well. The house creaked as it always had, but now every sound seemed to whisper possibilities. Elena lay awake imagining what might lie beneath. Storage, a cellar, perhaps nothing at all, but her thoughts kept circling back to the same feeling. This discovery had happened now, not earlier, not later, as if it had chosen this moment, when they felt most forgotten. Victor lay beside her, staring into the dark, remembering stories his grandfather used to tell about hidden rooms and old preparations made during harsher times. He had dismissed them as tales meant to entertain children, yet now they returned with unsettling clarity. By morning, a quiet determination had settled between them without words. Whatever lay beneath that slab, they would face it together, not as abandoned parents waiting to be remembered, but as two people still capable of discovering something new. When the sun rose and spilled pale light into the garden, Elena tied her shawl tighter, and Victor reached for the lantern they hadn't used in years. The passage beneath their feet had been buried by time, but it had not disappeared, and neither had they. Morning arrived with a thin, hesitant light, as if even the sun was unsure about entering a house that had known so much quiet. Victor carried the old lantern carefully, its glass cleaned for the first time in years, while Elena followed with a small bag of matches and a blanket folded over her arm, unsure why she felt the need to bring it. The garden soil was still damp from the night air, and when Victor lifted the stone slab again, the cold breath from below rose to greet them, sharper now, carrying the scent of wet stone and iron. He struck a match, shielding the flame with his palm, and the lantern came alive with a soft glow that barely pushed back the darkness. The steps leading down looked steeper in the daylight, narrower than either of them had expected, as if the passage had been designed to discourage the curious. Victor went first, gripping the stone wall with one hand, feeling the chill seep into his bones with every step. Elena followed closely, her heart beating so loudly she was certain he could hear it. The air grew cooler the deeper they went, heavy with silence, broken only by the faint echo of their breathing and the scrape of Victor's boots against stone worn smooth by time. Symbols carved into the walls began to emerge in the lantern light. Simple markings at first, then more deliberate ones, lines and shapes that stirred something in Victor's memory. He stopped once, tracing a finger over a symbol, and muttered that his grandfather had drawn similar marks in an old notebook, calling them signs of protection and preparation. Elena listened, her fear easing slightly as curiosity took its place. When they reached the bottom, the passage opened into a small corridor, the ceiling low enough that Victor had to hunch. At the end stood a wooden door reinforced with iron bands, its surface scarred and dark, as if it had endured more than mere age. Victor hesitated before touching it, suddenly aware of how long this door had remained closed, how many years it had waited in silence while lives above changed and moved on. Elena placed her hand over his, steady and warm, and together they pushed. The door resisted with a low groan, then slowly gave way, releasing a deeper cold and the unmistakable smell of dust untouched for decades. The lantern revealed a chamber carved directly from stone, its walls lined with wooden shelves that sagged under the weight of jars, boxes, and bundled cloth. A thick layer of dust coated everything, muting colors and softening edges, but the room felt orderly, intentional, as if whoever had built it expected it to be used, not forgotten. Elena stepped inside, her breath catching as the lantern light flickered across the shelves. Glass jars filled with preserved vegetables and grains sat neatly labeled in a handwriting that felt strangely familiar. Wooden boxes were stacked carefully, each marked with dates long past. In the center of the room stood a heavy table, its surface cleared except for a single leather-bound journal resting precisely in the middle, as if it had been placed there on purpose, waiting. Victor approached the table slowly, a strange tightness in his chest growing with each step. He wiped the dust from the journal's cover with his sleeve, and when the faded initials appeared, his hands began to shake. They belonged to his father. He opened the journal carefully, the pages thick and yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. The first words spoke of preparation, of hard winters and uncertain futures, of the belief that families survived not through wealth alone, but through foresight and unity. Elena leaned over his shoulder, reading silently, her eyes filling with tears she hadn't expected. This room was not a hoard, not a treasure chest meant to make someone rich. It was a promise made by people who had once stood where they now stood, people who had believed that even if the world above grew careless, something solid should remain below. Elena opened one of the wooden boxes, lifting the lid slowly, almost reverently. Inside lay old coins, not polished or ornate, but carefully wrapped, alongside small family heirlooms. A brooch she recognized from old photographs, a pocket watch Victor's father used to wear on Sundays. Beneath them were folded papers, letters addressed simply to those who remain. Elena's hands trembled as she unfolded one. The words inside spoke gently, acknowledging that children might leave, that paths would diverge, but reminding the reader that staying was not failure, and endurance was its own form of strength. Victor sank onto a crate near the wall, the weight of those words pressing into him. For years, he had carried bitterness like a shield, telling himself he didn't care, that abandonment was expected, almost earned. But here, in this quiet underground room, he felt that bitterness crack. Their children had taken many things when they left: furniture, money, pieces of the past, but they had left behind something far more important without realizing it. This place, this knowledge, this quiet dignity had never been meant for those who rushed away. It was meant for those who stayed, who endured the silence and still chose to live. Elena moved beside him, resting her head against his shoulder, and for a long moment neither spoke. The lantern flickered softly, casting warm light against cold stone, and in that gentle glow, the passage beneath their home began to feel less like a hidden space and more like a heartbeat, steady and alive, reminding them that even in abandonment, they were still part of something larger than their loss. Time seemed to loosen its grip once they began returning to the passage each day, as if the underground rooms existed outside the steady march of hours that governed the world above. Victor and Elena moved slowly now, no longer driven by fear or urgency, but by a growing sense of responsibility. They brought better lanterns, old gloves, and notebooks, treating the space not as a curiosity, but as something that needed care. Dust was wiped away shelf by shelf, revealing labels written with patient precision, dates stretching back decades, even centuries. Elena discovered bundles of seeds wrapped in cloth, each one carefully marked with planting seasons and soil notes. She held them as if they were fragile living things, marveling that something so small could survive so long in darkness, waiting for hands to believe in it again. Victor found tools stored neatly along a narrow side room: hoes, knives, hand drills, simple but well-maintained, coated lightly in oil that had preserved them against rust. It struck him that whoever had prepared this place had believed deeply in the future, even without knowing who would inherit it. That belief settled into Victor's chest like a steady warmth, pushing back years of quiet resentment. Deeper still, they uncovered a smaller chamber with wooden crates stacked against the wall. Inside were medical supplies wrapped in oilcloth, handwritten notes explaining their use in careful, patient language. Elena's eyes filled as she read, thinking of all the times she had felt helpless when illness came, wishing for guidance, for reassurance. Here it was, offered by hands long gone, still caring. One afternoon, overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all, Elena laughed, a soft, startled sound that echoed against the stone walls. It felt almost wrong, like laughter didn't belong underground, yet it also felt like the most natural thing in the world. Victor looked at her, surprised, then found himself smiling in a way he hadn't in years. "We thought we had nothing left," she said quietly, her voice catching. "But we were standing on everything." That realization shifted something deep between them. The passage was no longer just a discovery. It was a mirror reflecting how wrong they had been about their own worth. They began bringing small things down with them: photos, a chipped mug, a folded blanket, making the space feel lived in, connected to their present, not just their past. At night, by lantern light, Elena read aloud from the old journal, the words filling the stone room with voices of those who had once planned and worried and hoped just as they did. Victor listened, sometimes closing his eyes, imagining his father's voice, his grandfather's hands, all the generations that had worked so their descendants would not face hardship alone. The bitterness he had carried toward his children softened, not into forgiveness exactly, but into understanding. People left. Paths diverged. That truth no longer felt like a personal failure. The world above remained quiet, but their days below were full. Seeds from the passage were planted in the garden, their careful growth watched with almost reverent attention. Neighbors noticed the change first in the produce: vegetables richer in color, more abundant than expected. Elena shared freely, unable to keep the secret joy to herself. She didn't explain where the seeds came from, only smiled and said they were old, reliable varieties. Victor repaired fences, offered help, listened more than he spoke. Slowly, people lingered longer at their gate. Conversations stretched. The house that had once felt forgotten began to hum softly with life again. The passage became a place not only of storage, but of reflection. When doubts crept in, on quiet evenings when memories of their children returned sharply, they went below, sat at the central table, and let the steady presence of stone and history ground them. One evening, as Elena read a final letter aloud, her voice trembled. It spoke of forgiveness, not as something owed, but as a gift given to oneself. It spoke of how children might forget, how the world might change, but how the earth remembers every step taken upon it. Victor reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, feeling a release he hadn't known he needed. They were no longer waiting for phone calls that would never come, no longer measuring their lives by who was absent. They were caretakers now, of knowledge, of land, of a quiet legacy that had chosen them. The underground passage, once buried and forgotten, had become a living part of their days, shaping how they moved through the world above. It gave them something no apology or visit ever could, proof that their lives still mattered, that they were still capable of growth, of contribution, of quiet strength. And in that understanding, the ache of abandonment loosened its hold, replaced by a calm certainty that even when others walk away, something essential can still be found, waiting patiently in the dark, ready to be brought into the light. The sound of footsteps in the garden felt unreal at first, like an echo pulled from an old dream, and Elena froze with her hands still buried in the soil. Victor looked up from the fence he was repairing, his heart stuttering when he saw familiar figures standing by the gate, their outlines sharper than memory, their expressions strained and uncertain. Time had changed them more than he expected, yet the way they avoided his eyes was painfully familiar. Their children spoke quickly, voices filled with awkward warmth that didn't quite reach their eyes, asking about health, about the house, about how hard things had been. Elena listened quietly, noticing how their gazes wandered, measuring rooms, counting possibilities. There were apologies, lightly spoken, wrapped in explanations about busy lives and responsibilities elsewhere. Victor nodded, letting the words wash over him without interruption. He felt no surge of anger, no desperate hope, only a calm awareness of what this moment truly was. They had not returned because they missed them. They had returned because they needed something. When the conversation drifted toward finances and the value of the property, Victor gestured toward the garden and invited them to walk. The earth was dark and rich now, rows of healthy plants stretching toward the afternoon sun. Elena watched as Victor knelt and pressed his hand into the soil, letting it crumble through his fingers. He spoke slowly, telling them about tending the land, about patience, about how some things take years to reveal their worth. He mentioned the stone slab, the hidden passage beneath the ground, and saw curiosity spark instantly in their eyes. They asked what was inside, their voices sharpened with interest. Victor smiled gently and shook his head. He said some things are not meant for those who come only when they remember to, but for those who never leave. The words were not spoken in anger, but they landed heavily. The children exchanged glances, frustration flickering beneath forced smiles. They pressed a little more, but Elena stepped forward then, her voice steady, her expression kind but firm. She thanked them for visiting and said they were glad to see they were well. It was a dismissal wrapped in grace. When the gate closed behind them and their footsteps faded, Elena waited for the familiar ache, the hollow grief she had carried for so long. It didn't come. Instead, there was a quiet sense of completion, as if something unfinished had finally settled. That evening, as the sky darkened, Victor and Elena lifted the stone slab once more and descended into the passage, lanterns casting warm circles of light against the stone walls. The underground rooms felt different now, fuller somehow, as if they had witnessed something important. They sat at the central table, hands entwined, surrounded by jars, tools, and letters that had outlasted generations. Elena spoke softly about how strange it was that being abandoned had led them here, to something so grounding, so alive. Victor nodded, realizing that the passage had not replaced their children, but it had given them back themselves. They were no longer defined by who had walked away. They were defined by what they chose to protect and nurture. In the weeks that followed, the passage became a place of quiet teaching. Neighbors came, not to see it, but to learn from the results it produced. Seeds were shared, advice given, help offered without expectation. The garden thrived, and so did the small community that gathered around it. Victor found peace in working the soil, in passing on what he had learned, while Elena found joy in writing new notes to place alongside the old ones, letters meant for whoever might one day stand where they stood now. They wrote not with bitterness, but with honesty, reminding the future that love does not always return in the shape you expect, but it never truly disappears. One night, long after the lanterns were extinguished and the passage sealed, Elena lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like rest. She reached for Victor's hand, feeling the steady reassurance of his presence, and understood that abandonment had not been the end of their story, but the beginning of a deeper one. Beneath their feet, beneath years of disappointment and waiting, they had uncovered something enduring. Not gold or riches, but proof that even when children forget, even when doors close above, life leaves hidden passages for those willing to stay, dig, and believe.